going to use it in a lot of applications. All right, let's look at how you assign the look at the IP phones at this point. We've created the extensions. Before we do that, I do have a slide I want to look at. Okay. All right, so let's start a slideshow. So installing the IP phones. There's keep in mind what we do have a WAN port and a LAN port on the system, so it allows some flexibility, a lot of options on how you install the phones, and how you can connect it to the network. Okay, so this slide here shows the customer has an internet. They've got a broadband connection. They've already got an existing firewall. They've got their data network. They've got a LAN. All the devices are connected to a switch. You can connect the QX WAN, W-A-N, WAN port to that switch. It would get an IP from that DHCP server. On that same network, you've got the PCs, and you can also connect the IP phones, and they will configure through that WAN port. All right, you have to tell the system where those phones are located, whether they're on the LAN or the WAN. This time they're connected physically on the WAN side. All right, there's a setting for that we'll show you. But the system, if you have SIP trunks, it can get out through that firewall. You may need to configure that firewall, but it would be able to get outside to the internet and be able to receive traffic using SIP trunks. Maybe you've got FXO ports, but the phones, placement of the phones in this case is actually on the LAN port, or WAN port, sorry. The second scenario is very similar. The customer still has the same broadband connection, firewall, PCs, they've got a data network. The QX WAN port is connected to that network, so it can get outside access. The phones are physically connected on the LAN, L-A-N. It has maybe a separate switch, and that's probably the easiest configuration because the phones will get an IP address from the QX, and it works real well that way. A similar configuration to this would be, instead of connecting the WAN port to their data network, the WAN port could have its own public IP, its own broadband connection, which isn't unusual at all. So in that case, you've got the phones, the IP traffic, the voice over IP traffic is completely segregated from their data network. All right, so that's and we do have a couple other methods. You can also use VLAN to configure the phones. You can put the phones on a VLAN. We can act as the DHCP server within that VLAN on either the WAN or either the WAN or the LAN. So there's a lot of options on that. But let's take a look at that. Just keep that in mind as we go forward here. So we look at interfaces on the left. We click on IP lines. All right, first thing we want to look at is the tab here called IP line settings. So before you do anything, you want to make sure that you've got an option here to enable plug and play. We can also enable firmware version control, where we will control the firmware for either for the phone. That is available on Yealink, Snome, and the Mitel/Astra phones, the automatic firmware version control. Okay, and then down here at the bottom, you'll see the option says configure the phones from either the LAN or the WAN. So you have to tell the system, and that's important because we're going to provide a configuration file out to the phones, and the IP address that we're going to set, and that configuration file will be the system, either the LAN IP or the WAN IP based on this setting. So you need to tell the system where the phones are physically located. By changing that setting from either LAN or WAN, or vice versa, the system, and as soon as you save it, it will prompt you and ask you if you want to do a reboot. It's like one of the only settings in a system that requires a reboot. All right, so you want to set that early. All right, and then we'll look at our IP lines. All right, there's 3 methods of configuring your phones to the system. One is the easiest, is just simple plug and play. You connect the phone to the system, and if it's one of the phones that supports the plug and play option, then we automatically configure the phone. It comes up with the very first IP line that's available, as long as that extension, as long as that IP line has an extension available to it. In my case, if I were to connect the phone plug and play, it would not configure. Okay, the reason being is, sure, I've got a lot of available IP lines. You can see like IP line 11, 12, 13, those are all available, but there's no extension assigned to it. So when we go to configure that phone, it wouldn't know which extension to assign. Okay, ordinarily it would grab the first available IP line that's not used, but it has to have an extension assigned to it. Okay, so for me, right now, the way this is setting, I would not be able to do a plug and play. Okay, I would need to use the second method, which we refer to as autoconfig. Okay, with autoconfig, you choose the IP line, which also has the extension on it. Remember, you assign the IP line back at the extensions level. Okay, so here I just choose the IP line, and I change it. I activate the phone, IP phone, and now I choose the phone model. So in here you're going to see a very long list of available phones that we're going to configure. Okay, a lot of these Cisco's, there's you know, the Fanvilles and Grandstream and all their phones, and H-Tech, and you know, long list of phones. A lot of these phones are old. But they're still connected to some of these systems, and maybe the customer still has them. That's actually a plus with using our system. You can still configure like the SoundPoint IP300. You know, some of these are I think that's an older phone. But we'll still configure all these. Definitely the Snome 190, 200, 220 series. All right. So you'll just choose your phone model. You'll enter the MAC address. You're going to change the line appearance. Okay, let's say if this changes to a Yealink 46. By default, our line appearance is set to 2. If you're taking notes, you definitely want to change this to something higher than 2. 2 is kind of like what we use across the board, all phones. But this is going to limit the number of simultaneous phone calls to that phone. So if you have a phone, some phones only support 2 calls, and that's kind of like the minimum across the board. But in most cases, the phone will support quite a number of calls, and you know, if you want to have a call on hold and you receive a second call and then you go to transfer it, well, that right there is 3 calls. Okay, so you want to change this line appearance to something higher than our default of 2. Then you got the username and password. Okay, so this is the registration username and password. This is what allows the phone to register to the system to validate and authorize itself to the system. Okay, we assign it automatically a username. For example, LOC, local extension 107, and we will assign a password to it. All right, it's you know, again, you don't need to know what that password is. In most cases, you don't even care what that password is. The reason being is we're going to create a configuration file. It's going to be pushed out to the phone, And as part of that configuration file, it will have that username and password in it. Okay, by default, they're going to have good, strong, secure passwords. You don't have to worry about it. If I wanted to enter my own password, let's say I wanted to use something like 1234, it'll tell me, number one, that's very weak, and it doesn't meet the password security minimum requirements. Okay, so as you begin adding 1234, add some special characters, some letters, and then the password gets stronger as you go. And eventually you get a very strong password. It's easier if you're just trying to create a password. You can let the system use the password generator, and you can see the complexity of the passwords that we use. Obviously, these are just random generated, and they will never be guessed. So you can choose one of these. All right, just click on it, and actually just click on it, and that's the password that will be set. And then you save your settings, and then that's it. That's the second method of configuring the phones. We refer to that as auto config. All right, there is a third method. It's called manual config. Okay, so and this is for those devices that are not on our supported phone list. We're not going to configure, but they support SIP, so they should still basically work. Okay, so you've got soft phones, you've got video cameras, you've got door stations, you got a lot of SIP endpoints out there these days that you can configure, and they can register to our system. So for those devices, you're going to go in here, choose the phone model type. You're going to list it as the very bottom, and it says at the very bottom of the list, it says other. As soon as I do that, this MAC address gets grayed out. I can't change it. In this case, I will need to manually configure that device. So in this case, I need to know what that username is, local extension 109, and I need to know what this password is. So I can still choose a good strong password, and if I'm careful, I can highlight it, right click on it, I can copy it, and now I can choose it and select it, and that's the password that will be used. So now I need to go off to the device, configure the username, the password that I just set, point it to the IP address of the system, and using port 5060, and at that point it should register. Okay. So you got three methods of configuring your devices. Once the phone is configured, you'll see some keys over here on the right hand side. There's a reboot option, so I can reboot the phone. I can click web, which will connect me to the user interface of that phone. And you'll see here there's also an MPK, multifunctional programmable keys, MPK. All right, by clicking on that, it takes me to a page where I can configure the individual keys. So this is a Yealink SIP T27P phone, 21 keys on it, and I can choose the individual keys. Typically, pre-configured is basically whatever's on that default, what's been defined on that key. You're going to leave it as is. Okay, you're not going to change it away from what's already on that key on the phone. And that's we can call that pre-configured. Typically, you'll leave the keys 1, 2, 3 as is.